I'd like to introduce our roundtable. Francesca Minerva is a researcher of applied ethics at the University of Milan and co-founder and co-editor of the Journal of Controversial Ideas. Anders Sandberg is a researcher at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. Welcome to the roundtable. We're going to start with each of you giving a 1-minute speed pitch of your idea. And I'm going to start with Anders, and then Francesca, you will conclude, and then both of you will discuss back and forth.
One is that we have a right to enhance our brains. Since we have a right to our own lives, our thoughts, our bodies, and our freedom, it follows that we have a right to change our bodies and thoughts. The second claim is that this right is not totally unlimited, since there are ways of enhancing ourselves that actually fail. We can be misguided about what works or is safe, or there are enhancements that actually impact other people's rights. The third claim is that this is also deep down a negative right, a right to be allowed to do something rather than a demand that others help you do it. However, we do have a right to demand tolerance from others about the kind of modifications we do to ourselves. The fourth claim is that rights are also approximations rather than absolute things. They're a convenient way of packaging moral reasons that are usually true in a somewhat absolutist language that I think is helpful for guiding actions and societal rules. The smarter and the more morally enhanced we get, the more we can use the full ethical reasoning rather than relying on rights language. So that's kind of my 1-minute claims.
Are to a largest extent the consequence of certain brain functions. They depend on the kinds of interests individuals have, and this interest depends on certain cognitive capacities and the foreign brain functions. Entities with no brain are not usually attributed any kind of right. For instance, you can do anything you want to a lettuce or a rock. But when the capacity to feel pain emerges in the brain, a correspondent right not to be caused pain emerges as well. Those who can feel pain have a right not to be caused pain because they have an interest in not suffering. The right not to be caused pain is different from the right not to be killed. The right not to be killed emerges as soon as an individual develops the capacity to attribute a value to their own life. Once one has the capacity to attribute a value to their own life, they develop a right not to be killed. Future brain enhancement may add new capacities to our brains. For instance, some could develop a capacity to feel pain and happiness that is much more intense than our current one. And in that case, they would develop a right not to be inflicted pain that is stronger than the one we have towards current humans. Some brain might be enhanced to enable individuals to experience a whole range of emotions or capacities that we can't even imagine now. If they do, they might have a stronger claim not to be killed than we do. Or animal brains might get enhanced and develop the capacity to attribute value to their own lives and therefore develop a right to life. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Looking at the enhancements to the brain and rights. Now, Anders, do you have a comment to Francesca, and would you like to get this discussion and debate going forward?
Oh, yes, thank you. I find it very interesting because we need to think about what do we want to use the rights for. So I grew up being kind of a card-carrying liberal or libertarian who believed that, oh yes, rights are really absolute. And I wrote my paper on morphological freedom. And then later on, I started to hang out in the philosophy department and realized, oh, this is not easy at all. So I think an important question is what we want to use the rights for. And I think a lot of the rights discourse we have been having in philosophy has been kind of complacently assuming that, yeah, the only entities we need to care about are people and maybe animals. And then to keep us bioethicists very busy, okay, people in coma and cryonics patients and fetuses, okay, that's going to keep us busy long enough. But I think transhumanism actually brings up a really cool set of good challenges to the concept of rights that might actually be quite helpful for making us understand better our moral obligations.
Yeah, I agree with that. And yeah, I mentioned only humans and animals, but I guess when I think about, when I mentioned future humans with different capacities, that could be someone who is merged with machines, some merged artificial intelligence with human, or just some artificial intelligence that has become sentient and self-conscious. So I guess that this argument can and should be extended to non-biological creatures as well. And I guess we don't know yet whether these artificial creatures or the ones who will be merged with humans or animals will be capable of being conscious. But I personally think there is no reason to think they wouldn't. And so when they start developing indeed any cognitive capacity and interest, even though these interests might be completely different from the ones we have now, because they have completely different capacities, then they start having rights. So I was thinking, for instance, what if we can start uploading brains, and maybe merging brains will come a thing. So like maybe people have a right not to have their brain merged with another brain. Also like the right to protect yourself will become something quite different from what we mean now. So that's all up for discussion. I think it's very interesting and a lot of fun ahead.
Oh yeah, I think there's two important strands here. So one is this time perspective. Normally we tend to think about having rights at a moment in time, and that is of course linked to what kind of being you currently are. But of course there are some beings that will have different capacities and roles at different points in time. The classical debate topic is, of course, what about pre-persons like embryos or fertilized cells? But we, of course, also got the cryonics patients who are in some sense post-persons, but hopefully also pre-persons. Here, there might be rights that are linked to them in the future of the past. And of course, the animals that we might enhance, we might say maybe we actually need to treat the animal before we enhance it. Well, there is another thing that I noticed David mentioned, which I think is another strand, but it's also important. I was kind of coming from a rather consequentialist standpoint. I think Jeremy Bentham's talk about natural rights as nonsense on stilt make a lot of sense. So I'm taking a rule utilitarian perspective on rights, but they're convenient packaging. But I can imagine half of the ethics department saying, no. There are absolute things here. The Kantians and the other deontologists would say there are certain absolute moral duties, and rights might indeed reflect them. So there is something interesting going on there.
Yes, true. Again, like I also took a utilitarian perspective. So just like starting from the brain function, and then the interest and the cognitive capacity, and then the interest, and then the right. But a lot of people, maybe the majority of philosophers, don't really share that same view. So there are some absolute rights and absolute duties. But I wonder how a Kantian would change their attitude towards like absolute rights and absolute duties. I guess it is kind of more difficult to apply those old-fashioned duties and rights to creatures or to entities that are completely different if you don't start from something capable of evolving and changing as interest. So it would be interesting to have a Kantian telling us how they think, what are the duties and the rights of, future entities.
Yeah, and I think there is so interesting things happening there. My standard mental model of a Kantian would say, well, if you're sufficiently smart, you will be able to read all the works of Kant and realize he was right about everything, and then happily join that ethical view. And in some sense, it's a little bit like Turing universality in computer science. If you have a computer that's sufficiently general, it can emulate any other computer in that universality class. So Kantians would say that any sufficiently smart moral agent would be able to do it. The Kantians would be very concerned about losing your moral agency. If I could lock in my preferences right at this moment and follow them henceforth, I would kind of stop being a moral agent. And the Kantian would say, not only is that a stupid thing to do, it's kind of evil to do. You must not do it. It's a very bad thing to do. But conversely, it's not clear if you're a Kantian that you should be going around making animals and machines and rocks into moral agents. It's not given that that is necessarily a better world. Although I could imagine the cosmist Kantian saying, oh, we should be bringing moral agency to the universe.
Yes, exactly. And it's also like weird because Kant himself believed that, for instance, animals had no rights because he thought they were just the same as rocks. He thought that didn't have any capacity to reason, to think, to have any desire, to act upon their desires. I mean, I think he was, obviously we can tell now, quite wrong about it. We know that animals have desires and can act upon their desires. But then he has had his idea that humans have something very special about themselves, like some intrinsic value. And he kind of explained that by saying, oh, because they're capable of reasoning. So I wonder, like, if there would be creatures that would be better reasoning than humans, will they have more intrinsic value? And how is that going to change the duties we have and the rights we have as humans who have a lesser capacity to reason than future, post-humans or artificial intelligence entities?
Yeah, I think I'm certainly not a Kantian scholar in any way, but it seems to me that it's kind of a universality class of once you're sufficiently able to reason, you can figure out the moral reasons properly, and that's it. There doesn't seem to be any extra levels. But you could imagine some form of hyper-Kantian arguing that maybe there are actually higher levels. I think that is tricky to do in Kant's framework, but you could imagine lower levels and actually encounter some animal rights philosophers who have been arguing that there are some forms of reasoning and goal-directed behavior in animals that actually give them certain rights. And certainly they're being sensitive and being able to suffer might make them more patient. So Kant is not exactly there is a lot of the ontologists who actually think animals deserve to have quite a lot of right. It's much easier to think about these higher levels if you're taking some kind of consequentialist perspective. But then, of course, the utility monster starts lurking in the corner. What if we make something that just gets so happy by having resources that we ought to be giving it all the resources? And normally philosophers would say, yeah, that's a very fun thought experiment showing a problem for utilitarians. But if you're a proper transhumanist, you might say, maybe we could make utility monsters and maybe we then ought to make them. That sounds also rather problematic.
Yeah, true. Sorry, somebody else was saying something? Oh. Okay.
Well, I think we're supposed to be tearing into each other's views now, then we get into the comment part. But certainly the chat is full of interesting questions. Sorry for that. I think there is something interesting about whether we can enhance animals, because it gives a counterpoint to always talking about enhancing humans. Transhumanism is open to questioning the human condition, which also means that we actually can question the condition of octopi. Now, an uplifted octopus would probably think in such an alien way that it's very unclear what part of our philosophy actually works, because individuality, for example, which we normally assume is a very big deal in our own rights and thinking, they might be rather distributed in an intelligent octopi. And then, of course, the cyborgs are also showing that humans might develop in such a way that you have modules that we might be sharing or moving between the different cyborgs. It's one thing if Cyborg Anders gives Cyborg Francesca an arm, because the arm is not thinking. But if we start exchanging part of our brains, at that point, we suddenly have kind of Anders Prime and Francesca Prime. They're somewhat new entities, but related to past entities. And I don't think we have a great moral language for speaking about this.
Yeah, no, definitely true. I was thinking while you were speaking whether you think that in case we could enhance animals, whether you think we would have a duty, because I mean, obviously, in one sense, it would be more in their interest because they then would get like a right to live, and maybe would increase the quality of their lives. But philosophers have discussed for a long time whether animals would have the kind of right to be enhanced and become pretty much like human, like to become person, we would say. So we say that some animals count as persons because they have the capacity to attribute a value to their own life, like elephants, some corvids, maybe octopus, but most animals don't. So do you think we would have a duty to do that if we could?
I think it has to do with whether it would make their lives in the enhanced form better in some sense. So I could imagine uplifting dogs, so at least they had a better grasp of human language, might actually be a good thing, not just for humans around the dogs, but also for the dogs, because they're already part of our social community. Certainly the dogs didn't choose to be domesticated by humans, and indeed intelligent dogs might want to hold us for account for quite a lot of things we have done to them, but they're now part very much of in some sense of the human family. It's much less clear for the cat. It's not clear whether an uplifted cat would actually benefit from understanding humans or being intelligent. I can imagine that it could make use of it, but it's very different because it's not quite part in the same way. And certainly once we start talking about uplifting our food animals, oops, that's probably not a good idea at all. In fact, we might want to do the opposite. We might want to get our food from beings that have as little moral standing as possible.
This is a very interesting debate, and I think a timely one, because currently a lot of the questioning and concern about transhumanist agenda is the lack of awareness of other life forms, which is contrary because, as you said, Anders, the human condition includes the ecology of all life forms that we coexist within. And in that inclusivity, you just said something about dogs. Dogs didn't ask to be bred into what they are today. But if we look at some of the work that's been done with animals, such as Coco, the gorilla, Coco was able to program her own identity in large part through the use of symbolic language and the application of a computer, and also in choosing her mate. So it was very interesting, that level of cognizance that was afforded to her with an augmentation of a computer and a camera, of course, and a keyboard to make that choice. But let's go, I just wanted to make that comment. And Francesca, I love the elephant behind you. I'm an elephant aficionado, and the relationship of elephants within their community and their level of intelligence and cognizance about death, in which you are an expert as a philosopher and ethnicist. The ceremony of death that elephants perform and their burial procedure is quite phenomenal as far as being on an intellectual level of self-awareness that is appropriate when we think about intelligence and upgrading the brain.
I'm not an expert on Getier's work here, but I do think there is something interesting, that some parts of ethics are probably just equilibria of game theory. It turns out that there are some behaviors that probably just make sense because of the way the universe works. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily natural rights, but they might be reasonable compromises or useful thing. For example, I did a paper a few years back about moral enhancement, where we had simulated agents that could update how much they cared about themselves and others. And it turned out that because of symmetry, being pro-social, caring both about yourself and the other agent in games, was a stable equilibrium point. You got generally that agents, even though they were just trying to make themselves as happy as possible, were enhancing themselves, so they ended up caring about equally for themselves and others. In a more competitive situation, they became a little bit more individualistic, but it was very clear that this is just game theory. We could have worked it out without a computer simulation on a napkin if we'd just been smart enough when starting the project. And I do think that game theory.
Very good point, yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I certainly became kind of a liberal/libertarian by reading about the iterated prisoner's dilemma, realizing, oh yeah, if I want to function well, I need reciprocity. There is a good game theoretical argument, even if I'm a totally selfish sociopath, to behave in this way in order to function in society. Now, actual societies are way more richer than game theory. There is much more built-in hardware for empathy, compassion, a feeling of justice, some of which we should be careful about trusting too much because it might be biased, but some of it that is just making human existence bearable and working rather well. Having a high trust environment is great, and we want to construct that. So I do think Gettier is getting at something important here.
I think it was Francesca who was discussing her theoretical approach as Edward asked made the comment, you highlight the problems of being Kantian. And Francesca, you address that really beautifully in some of the issues of what would Kant do if he were here today, as far as his, I guess I would call it a hierarchy of rights, of who is right and the absoluteness of right. Would you like to comment to that?
Yes, as I was saying, I mean, I think it would be, I mean, as we develop new technologies and we might be able to upgrade our brains and develop completely new capacities, I think that it would be quite difficult for Kant to elaborate further this theory, right? Because in part, I think there is some sort of maybe religiosity in a way, or like something which is intrinsically good about humans because because they are humans. So I guess you could have two options: either to say, well, the new entities are as valuable, as intrinsically valuable as humans, or or the less valuable because they're artificial. Maybe there is something that even if they have better skills and better capacity to reason, they don't have this intrinsic value because they're more like machines. Or whether I would say, well, it's like everybody has equal values insofar they have the same capacity to reason. So it's an open question. I'm not an expert. I'm not a Kantian, so it would be interesting to know from Kantian who knows.
Even there, you bring up an especially important issue, and that's of the hierarchy of the anthropocentric sensibility of human being right and above all else. And the biggest challenge that we've discussed amongst many of our colleagues and friends here is that artificial intelligence gaining more intelligence than human, and what does that do to us? It affects our ego largely, but also makes us realize that we are not the center of the universe. And of course, Copernicus and Galileo really fought that cause for us early on. But I think that once we get into these issue of what has more efficacy or intelligence, it really becomes an issue of political correctness, and certainly assuages a lot of biases about which type of intelligence is more important than another type of intelligence, because we know intelligence is not just one thing or realized as one thing. I'd like to go to another. Oh, go ahead. Yes, Anders.
May I respond? Because I think there is something very interesting here, because Kant would probably say, look, I'm not arguing about any detail about humans. He would say, this is all about reason. You should be thinking and reasoning, and if you're a moral agent, you're going to behave in the right way. Then I think later readers would say, yeah, he's actually importing a whole bunch of assumptions about what kind of being humans are into his system. But he's trying to not be that anthropocentric. On the other hand, his great antagonist, in a sense, Hume, argued that, look, our moral and our reason, it's driven by passions. We have certain emotions and passions, and that is a good reason why we have these values and why certain things make our lives go better and some things make our lives go worse. There, it's actually much more tied to what kind of creatures we are. So if we encountered aliens or artificial intelligences that have very different passions, you might say, they would actually properly have totally different morality. Kant would say if they're moral agents, they should actually be having our kind of morality. It might still be that he has to accept that maybe the alien and the AI have somewhat different interests because we function differently. The AI might not fear death because it always have backup copies. The alien might have a very weird sense of identity or weird categories of experience of world, but that would be fine. My own take on this is that we should be open for that there are quite a lot of different sources of value. If you take a consequentialist perspective, you might say, well, pleasure might be good. It might be intrinsically good, or it might be a tool for making us do good things in the world. We might have various laundry lists of what makes our life go better. And some of those elements, like friendship, might just be applicable if you're a mammal. Octopi might not have friends. They might actually not be social enough creatures for them to make sense. And it might be that AI programs similarly don't have friends, but they might have other interesting categories that matter here. So the really interesting possibility with enhancement is, of course, that we could widen the categories we could have. We could have get new kinds of reasons to cherish certain things. I quite often bring up this thought experiment of monkeys thinking about becoming post-monkeys, that is humans, realizing, oh, we can get so much bananas. And it's true, we humans can get way more bananas because we're smarter. It's just that we fill our lives with way more than fruit. We actually found that, oh, philosophy and politics and art and many things monkeys can't appreciate are actually very worthwhile. And post-humans might similarly have not just the ability to cherish a banana and some philosophy, but also do these things that we cannot even detect that right now there is a value. The real problem is, of course, when the post-humans want to do something that somewhat infringes on the human interests, and they say, look, this is super important for us for reasons we can't explain, but you have to take a word for it. At that point, we get to the question how much we can trust them.
So let's go to a question over here by Didier. I'm just going to pick one here. Should we be obligated or obliged, excuse me, to protect sentient animals even against natural hazards, predators? Once you think animals have rights, they have rights even when humans are not causing harm. Francesca, do you want to respond to that?
I personally think we do. I think we have a duty towards wild animals, not just towards pets. I think like if we know, I mean, we know that in the wilderness there is a lot of suffering going on, and you know, this suffering is not inflicted by humans. It's just like the natural predator and herbivore relationship, but that doesn't suggest to me that we might not have any duty to intervene. Now, the problem is that intervening might cause side effects that we can't foresee, and that might be catastrophic and even worse for the animals involved and for other creatures. But if we were 100% sure that all these side effects were not negative and we could intervene, I think we should do it. And I mean, I honestly collect snails. When I walk on the street, I collect snails on the street and put in the gardens because I'm worried they might be stomped on by people. So I guess we can all do a little bit, but obviously it's not clear what is the impact on a large scale. So that would be my only concern. But in principle, I think we should.
Okay, good.
There is a real interesting
Anders,
problem.
hold on just a second.
Sorry.
We've reached our time limit. We have to go to our workshops. So I'm going to give you now, Anders, you will have, if there's any rebuttal that you'd like to make to Francesca, anything that you agree with Francesca on, and or a way that you could formulate your diverse and unique and combined ideas in a closing statement. Anders, I'll start with you and then I'll go to Francesca and then close out. So Anders, please go ahead.
So there is that famous saying, with great power comes great responsibility. And of course, it wasn't Spider-Man who said it, and it wasn't his uncle, it was actually Voltaire. And I think there is a great deal of truth to that. If you can't foresee the consequences of your actions, you're not very responsible. We're smart enough to foresee a lot of consequences, and that means that we get a lot of headaches. We actually can foresee that those snails might be in trouble, so we might need to save them. if we were less able to foresee things, we might not have a duty towards those snails. And I think we are going to find that the transhumanist project of enhancing human capability, insight, the ability to actually affect the world might give us more moral duties. So in some sense, if you want to avoid having too much duties, you might not want to enhance yourself. But I think we should be aiming at being as good and post-human as we can possibly be. I think that this might actually be a good moral reason to do it. And here I think even Kant would say, yeah, actually, if you become better at being moral, that's probably a good thing to do.
Yeah, I agree with you. So I think we both agree on the fact that brain enhancement would be a good thing, even though we should take into account all the possible consequences. And, there might be a lot of implications we can't think of. So we have to become also smarter at the same time. But indeed, that could be the goal. Like the smarter we become, the more moral we become, and maybe we want to be more moral. I think we agree on this and on most things, actually.
Well, I think it's lovely to agree from different backgrounds and different perspectives, and I think that the larger issues you did cover, both of you, eloquently and effectively. So thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
this session.